recording. Today's webinar will be about how to identify and defend your research methods and methodology. And we hope that the general learning outcome will be to provide you with some guidance on structuring and building up your doctoral thesis research project. And more specifically, to be aware that students often do struggle simply because they want to select a method before they really know the research problem or the existing studies of relevance to the problem or the wider literature in the research field. And to understand the placement of research methods and methodologies within your thesis, and that you perhaps want to realize that the research methods should be derived from exactly the research problem, from existing studies and the wider literature in the field. And with this, we hope that you will get an overview on how to apply your research methods. And towards the end, we will go exactly into a group activity that is moderated by Jack, which aims to reflect on how well your research methods has been derived from related studies and what you might want to consider in the future. So with this, why do students often struggle to select a method? And what is this word select doing here? Wait a moment. Where does that come from? Who is the selector? Is it the creativity of the researcher that is bringing the method about? Is it the supervisor and a particular skill and experience that the supervisor brings along? Or is it perhaps the faculty and the program design that have certain requirements on how the thesis must be developed and which methods should be used? Now, it's often in the basics or the lack of an understanding of the basics where things do go wrong. And attending seminars on methodologies will provide you with little support on how to bring your methods together. So let us see why this is the case. And perhaps a spoiler alert, the lack of understanding might well apply to faculty and supervisors alike. And we will see why this could well happen and why that also is a sort of defect by design situation. Now, let's look into that more in detail. To be aware that students often struggle simply because they want to select a method before they know the research problem. So do you know the research problem? Do you exactly have an understanding what your research will be about? If that's the case, then very well, the research method will lend itself to you. It will come naturally to you, and it will be as a part of the research journey. Now, there is little creativity, unfortunately, to be put into that. And I think that is something that often is bothering to students because there is a bias toward actions. It's not uncommon that students within the first 5 minutes know exactly what methods they will be applying, and they already know the exact questions that they will be asking. And very often a survey instrument is developed within no time because those are the interesting and motivating things. And this is where time is invested in. However, the tricky thing in here is that the research problem only will gradually emerge as the research progresses. And this bias, therefore, in the meantime, is taking over and driving often the research and therefore driving it off the road. Now, likewise, existing studies of relevance to the problem. Now, it's very difficult to know what are existing studies if the problem is unknown or not understood. And this is a very crucial role in which your supervisor can provide you with initial guidance, but also something where you can train yourself very well, that, you know, keep the focus of the research on understanding very well what is it that you are examining and what are the existing studies in the field. And as more as you will go along, as more you will be exploring questions like, that was a bit too quick, like what methods and methodologies have been applied, what are their foundations and groundings, how have these methods worked out, what worked out well, what were the shortcomings, what have earlier studies found about the problem and what remained unknown. So as more as you do understand what is answered and what is known and how things have been explored, as more natural it will become for you to adopt your method. However, that also will imply that you read the literature with a focus on how studies have been developed, on which type of questions have been asked, and about which type of data has been collected and how it has been analyzed. This is to say you work over the analytical component and rather not about the conclusion end, where you just pick from the studies what research was finding out, because if you do so, then you will not explore how the data has been collected or how it perhaps has been analyzed and evaluated. So depending on the reading lens, this will vary very much. And if you don't know what is meant about that, we have been running a webinar on critical literature review earlier this year, and the recording likewise is available for replay. Now, as more as you will go along, as more you will understand the wider literature in the research field, you will be able to build up perspectives, and you will be able to understand limitations of existing methods that have been applied, or why things are still not explored or understood. And therefore, you will be able to build up your boundaries and to blend things. So it's something that over the time will progress and will become available. Now, how quick that goes very much will depend on how you consult the literature and what are you aiming to find out. If you're just reading literature to find conclusions on how things could be improved, the likelihood is great. You can spend the first year just reading and consulting the literature without any significant advancement on that matter. However, if you look targeted into the literature and start reading it over the analytical and critical component and look into which type of data has been collected, how has it been evaluated, which type of answers have been answered, which questions still do exist, then you will advance much quicker and the methodology will lend itself to you, and you will know which type of methods to bring together, which type of frameworks to pick, and how to compile your own research instrument. And with this, you will also understand how are existing studies different and what could be combined in which way, and perhaps what others have been already combining. Now, those questions are also good questions to ask directly to your search engine of choice. Like if you identified one method and another method that you could consider because another study was suggesting that, then the search engine of choice can tell you if and how and where those methods have been already tested in the past and what were the findings and outcomes. So as said, this is a very structured process, and there's little to no innovations that need to go into that, but rather it depends that you work very close from the analytical end and not over the conclusion end. Now, the tricky thing here is, and again, who is selecting the method? If those things become only known to you over time, then perhaps only after the first year you have a clear understanding about what method you will be using. And therefore, the supervisor that was selected 18 months earlier, or the faculty program at which you enrolled earlier, might not be matching with the type of research as it developed. Now, if you see that this is happening, and we see that often happening to students, then there are solutions that could be taken, which is, for example, to change the program, or also to work out how to research question, research problem, outcome expectations and method built into each other and what could be changed, and therefore refocused. A problem can often be analyzed from very different angles. If you take as an example problem high fluctuation rates in an organization, then those high fluctuation rates could be examined against very different perspectives. You could look into that from a behavioral perspective, you could look into that from a leadership perspective, you could look into that from a process perspective, or you could look into that from a communication perspective. Now, those are four very different fields, and depending on where you would take the research, the method and approach would vary considerably. Now, if you are enrolled in a given program and need to tick certain parameters, then again, depending on the analytical lens that you will adopt, you might or might not refocus or focus the research in a way that it is matching to the faculty and program design or to the supervisor skills and experience, and perhaps also and importantly to your outcome expectations. Now, getting all of that lined up shows already the great likelihood for research going wrong or getting stuck and not working out as you expected. But having said that, if you understand that this is such a complex situation, then that might be a good mean for you to try and look into where are you and how will you work out your methods. Are there any questions about the first part thus far? Okay, so then let's move into the second part of that webinar, placement of research methods and methodology. Now, perhaps you want to understand that your research methods and methodologies are an integral part of your thesis. So it's not only that it's something to be written up in the methodologies chapter, which is usually chapter 3. And for once, this written up terminology that often faculty and supervisors use is perhaps a bit misleading, because you do not finish one chapter to then progress with the next one. Research is not linear. That's something that you might want to understand, and you do not finish a chapter and then start another one. What you do is you work over drafts, and it is not uncommon that after the literature draft structure, you might want to rather look into the data. And yes, that can be done because a lot of times research is carried out not in the abstract, but in the concrete. And where it is carried out in the concrete and not in a lab environment, you will have data at hand from earlier observations. So this type of non-linearity is important, and so far that your thesis is building up gradually as a whole, and the methodology is part of all of it. It is part of the literature review, it is part of the scene setting and overview of your work, and it will provide the structure for you on presenting your data, and likewise how to do the analytics and evaluations, and right up till the end where you present the outcomes. So methodology as an integral part, not as an isolated one, is one of the basic considerations to consider. Now, what is it with the methods versus methodology? Now, in a nutshell, a source of confusion is that the words are often treated synonymously, even though they do not mean the same thing. Methods are a practical hands-on step for doing research, while methodology is a discussion of methods and how you bring the methods together. So the methodology chapter, therefore, is also considering the frameworks that you build your research on. And likewise, it is not uncommon that students are asked, okay, what is the methodological frameworks that you will adopt? And you're expected to answer that. Can you do so? In the absence of a clear problem understanding, in the absence of understanding what is the related literature, in the absence of having a holistic perspective of the field. This is a very tricky and difficult thing, and therefore understand that likewise, those methods only will become available to you gradually. Now, the methodology section in a research paper needs to achieve 3 things, though not necessarily in this order. First, it should consider what the nature of academic work is more generally and what this might mean for anyone who explores the topic at hand. Secondly, it needs to provide a literature review discussing what method researchers have traditionally used to study the kind of topic. Thirdly, it should explain what methods this particular project uses and why. Now, do you see any patterns here in this advice? Let's look into that. Firstly, secondly, thirdly, chapter 1, chapter 2, chapter 3. Now there are patterns, and patterns are more often out there than you would understand. If you see here, the basic considerations at the beginning are very well aligned with those suggested 3 considerations. Now, there's a pattern, there are structures, and it is a very structured and non-exciting way to work out your methodology for your thesis. It's just that you are doing it the first time, and therefore it might feel a bit odd and overwhelming. Now, we already talked about non-linearity, and we talked about graduality. And research is gradual and it is non-linear, while it is presented in exact the opposite way. Now, let's look into this table. It will look very linear and nicely. On the left side, we are at the proposal stage, and at the right side, we are at the thesis development stage. Now, we see a common structure starting over the problem statement, the research questions, the key literature, methodology, data and findings, analysis and evaluation, and conclusion. So this is a common coverage of a thesis, but also of a proposal. And likewise, it's something that your research will be working through. Perhaps not as linear as it is presented here. And this is something that also needs to be understood. As said, you can spend the first year easily reading literature, and you will get a great knowledge out of there. No doubt, the question is about what and how relevant it will be. Now, the different parts of your research and of the thesis are interconnected, and data points are a great mean to help guiding you in your reading, in identifying key literature sources, in developing and framing research questions, and understanding which type of questions anyway have been asked already and answered, and what are the questions that you still should be asking and how. So if you juggle in between the literature and the data and gradually build up your research, then this is a very effective way to progress. All that it needs is a bit of training and how to do that. And then you will see how well you can mirror out the structure of your thesis and see how things work together. Now, for this to be possible, however, requires to move beyond abstract naming, research problem, research question, and move into concrete use of titles that will help you on building up the different ends of your research and to understand where things are connected and how well do they flow. Is the logic in place and is a narrative coming out consistently? Now, this is a gradual thing that you will be doing over the time as you progress through your research project. And if you have questions about this mirroring approach, be welcome to join our webinar at 5th of May, in which we will be looking into this more in detail. And there's also a replay available from past webinars where we discussed that already. Now, while you're working out the methods, this might be a sequential process, but it's not a linear one. It's a juggling through, and it will be gradually building up. And there are many tools and techniques that can help you doing so, and so to identify the methods and methodology for your own research. Now, deriving and justifying research methods. This is actually a quite straightforward thing, because the research method will be derived from the existing studies of relevance. So this is, and as you see, there's a pattern and there's a sort of repetition, but it is as simple as that. You work over existing studies and there's little excitement in there. And this will provide you with a basic for clearly articulating the reasons why one particular technique was chosen in preference for another one. If you compare them against the research problem and against the questions that you would want to answer, this will allow you with the granularity that you need to bring up the argument and to clearly articulate reasons why one is more suited or seems to be more suited than the other one. And there might be a great deal of justification and reasons, with time being, for example, one reason that still will limit the degree of freedom that you can put into any type of study, or the boundaries that you see emerging, and therefore one method is more geared towards exploring that problem within that boundary. So as long as you comply with it, you will be on the relative safe side, and even where examiners might disagree once it comes to the viva stage, research is still much about logical arguments, about questioning and disagreement. So this means even though there might be a disagreement, as long as you can justify in a logical manner why you took those choices, there might still be a consensus. And there's something in academia which is called that we can agree to disagree. Now, while other researchers might disagree with your choices, they will accept what you have done as long as this can be objectively explained and challenged. Now, I think the point here is the objectively, because research is about challenging the accepted and being critical, but it must be done in a constructive manner, and it should be done based on data and facts and techniques. So research is a learning journey, and likewise, research is progressing, so the understanding of what can be done or not will change over time. Once I've been taking my thesis, for example, my supervisors did tell me, look, Andreas, you cannot be doing focus group online. This is nothing that works over the internet. Now, those were still comparative early days of the internet. If you would take that argument further, perhaps at current times, the world would have needed to shut down entirely, including virtually, because things just cannot be done virtually. As we learn, they can. And so is the understanding of research emerging and what can be done and how it can be done. And again, as you work over existing studies, it will show what worked out well and what not. And from that, we can learn. But those existing studies will also allow your supervisors and anyone with whom you engage in your research to come on board. So to have a shared understanding and view of what shall be done and how it shall be done. So working over that is something that can put you on the comparative side, but beware to not opinionate. And this is a thin line in between having the courage to stand up to something and argue your way out and to start opinionating. And if you do not train that well, it might go very bad in a scientific argument, and you don't want to leave that experience for some event like the Viva point. So try and test yourself and build up skills on the ends where you need them. So how to apply research methods? Now, if you understand what has been done in previous studies and how it has been done, then this is a straightforward way. Let's look in this example thesis. As can be seen from the literature, persuasion can influence others. So there are 3 people who have been looking into this, and is often dependent on credibility of the sender, the persuasiveness of the argument message, or the responsiveness of the audience. Again, literature that has been looking into that, and those parameters like responsiveness, argument and message, persuasiveness, have been provided in that literature to me, so I can be building on that. And thus persuading people to change can be particularly difficult, so Jackson will have looked into that and can tell me what is difficult in there. And with this, I will be able to advance on those existing studies to just build up my own focus group roundtable discussions and building on examples on how I could work. And the beauty of working over existing studies, like in this case, for example, a study which is on tackling big problems in infection prevention and control, this study will clearly tell me and show me how I could use mixed methods in a systematic, transparent method to identify, analyze, and co-create with stakeholders. And this can help me to build up my research. So working over this end is a very viable and concrete way to build up your own research. And as more precise and as more close those studies are to what you want to explore, as better the guidance will be. Remember, however, the trickiness is as long as the problem is not understood by you, as long as you don't know literature of relevance, relevance to what, as long as you don't build up a perspective, what else could be done, this seems to be often a more overwhelming task. But if you try to break it down and make clear what you understand and what not, this can lead you to already some studies, and studies lead to studies, and knowledge gradually will emerge. So try to not be too creative, channel your creativity, don't invent from scratch. It's easy to be said. I know, on the other hand, we see from students, it's very tempting Just action, 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 doing, 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 doing. This is so much more tempting than sitting, 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 thinking, thinking, thinking. Try to limit your innovativeness. Build on how others have done it. Try to adapt what worked well and improve what did not work. Try to improve by adapting what worked in related studies and in the simplest form for each question that you want to ask in an interview. Check if others have asked it already, and then check why do you want to ask it again. Is there something new you could get out of that question? Is there something else? Do you want to look from a different perspective? And if you want to look from a different perspective, then check, has no one looked at that from that perspective? So again, it's a very structured way of working through methods, questions, and what you want to do. And the beauty here is that such existing studies also will provide you with the theoretical and conceptual frameworks that can be built together, and understand that it is not such thing as settling on perhaps only one framework or just using one framework. You might find out that a blending of existing frameworks from different studies for your particular research would be required, and this is absolutely fine and fair as long as you explain it well. So, and also understand that the way you write up the research might be very different to the way you carried it out. And this is because you present the research within a formulated narrative and within a linearity that will not have been perhaps in place as it was carried out. And finally, know about the role of reverse engineering, which can be a mighty tool and your friend once putting together the thesis, and in particular, if used with other tools like mirroring, which in the following slide we will be looking into, so that you know how the things relate to each other. There will be many different forms of reverse engineering, depending on the point in time, depending on how well the methods have been already putting into place, or at which point in time you find relevant studies that put your research in a very different context. And we had that at a session earlier this week where we exactly looked into how to present the research in the Viva, and a student pitched his research and it looked like the framework was the answer. Now, is it the question or is it the answer? In this case, it was an overwhelming feeling that the framework was rather the question, and therefore it would have come at the initial part of the research to provide the method and framing to just ask the questions and motivate and justify what subsequently has been done. So depending on where you are in the research and how you present things, things might be worked out very different, and reverse engineering can help you doing so if you combine it with mirroring, which means to specifically and not abstractly work through and with in your proposal. So as more as you use specific names and titles that represent of what has been done, that represent what you have been looking at, as more clear it will become to you how well your research aligns. And at one point in time, you might want to draw it up this in a way like is presented in this slide. That looks like you knew directly from day one how the research would be done. And this is why you can be that specific and in a simple paragraph, in a simple diagram, show how the entire research has been working out and coming together. Now, while this figure is presented within the introductory part of your thesis, the truth is it was developed likely at the very end and only once the research was fully understood. Now, stages therefore do matter, and if you understand where you are in your research, then that can provide you with much better and more tailored training. If you want to learn a bit more about how to work out your research methods and methodologies, we have two different sources at hand. And the one is an advanced training course on issue identification, problematizing, and research question framing, which is suitable for those that still do not have the problem fully understood. However, if you are at a later stage and already collected your data and now just want to write it up and feel it's still not coming together as you hoped. So then please take a look into this course, focusing on writing up and structuring your thesis, which might provide you with some further guidance on that end. And with this, we come towards the end of the recorded session. And